Okay, I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. So we have a really special discussion tonight. I've got Tristan Gabriel here and Dr. Stephen Cox. Tristan, he's been here several times in the past. Dr. Stephen Cox is new to this platform, so I want to welcome him to the show. And I'm going to hand it off to Tristan now so that he can open this up and do the introductions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Steve and I, we connected because we had similar interests on the topic of critiquing the covenant view of full preterism, namely the spiritual resurrection that is so prevalent in the covenant full preterist view. And lately, it's been receiving a lot of noise. It's been gaining a lot of momentum, even amongst full preterists who disagree with the Max King Don Preston view of the resurrection that was supposed to happen in 70 AD. Many times in the past, I have brought up two academic disciplines that are highly regarded, even amongst Christians, and that is epistemology and neuroscience. And Dr. Steve and I, we connected through Facebook, we messaged each other, and we just soon realized the errors of this, and there's a background with Dr. Cox and full preterism, and I was just very impressed, very drawn to his knowledge and his background, his profession involving neuroscience, and so I find it a privilege and an honor to gain more insight theologically, scientifically, and I believe this is going to benefit the viewers who are interested in this topic, especially those who are wanting more clarity on this supposed spiritual resurrection, this restored fellowship, this covenantal change that has been critiqued, ever since the covenant full preterist view first emerged, even all throughout the history of this movement. So, Dr. Cox, thank you so much for having this time with me, and I'm ready to learn. We've talked in the past, but I'm all ears, and I would absolutely love to gain some more insight on this topic. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think first and foremost, I'll share a little bit about my background and how we came together, because I think there's real power in the story. I think everybody has power in their stories, and probably if more people felt comfortable sharing their journeys, a lot of things might be revealed, and it would help resolve conflict for a lot of people. I grew up in a very small town in North Mississippi, just south of Memphis, Tennessee, where essentially, there was a main Baptist church and a main Methodist church, and pretty much you were one of those two growing up. And so I grew up Baptist, pretty much in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesdays, and I don't really remember having much of a choice. And, as I look back, something in me really did not feel right in those settings. And I didn't really know how to pinpoint it, because there was really nobody to ask. And so as I, grew up through high school and then into college, I joined the Army for a little while. I was able to kind of get away from that area and the kind of the prevailing, viewpoint that you're immersed in growing up, and started kind of asking some different questions. And so, as I was in a couple of different universities, Ole Miss and Mississippi State, and then finished my undergraduate degree with pre-med and then a kind of a combination of some marketing stuff in there, and decided not to go to medical school at the time, but ended up in a teaching position for one of the top drug companies in the world in their central nervous system divisions, cardiovascular medicine, and infectious disease. And that kind of shaped my view on, on health at the time. And I started questioning what was going on in the pharmaceutical industry, and kind of decided to look back into some different aspects of alternative medicine and complementary medicine, and chose to go back to school. And, long story short, bringing a background of neuroscience into that, and then a postdoctoral neurology program out of kind of a mixture of chiropractic, osteopathic medicine, and along with traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. The reason I looked to blend those is because it seemed to me that the function of the brain was key to bodily function, but also to someone's subjective experience of who they were, how they were shaped. And I've been in clinical practice now for a little over 25 years. Actually, it'll be 26 in the spring. And what shaped my journey, I guess, significantly within the biblical viewpoint is that when I got into clinical practice, my very first patient had a brain tumor. My second patient was being treated for breast cancer. And then I saw this trend where everybody that came to see me seemed to be suffering from some major conflict. Like the lady with breast cancer, she was active in a church that, you could tell that the stipulations for her on only being a certain way and having to uphold their mindset and views, it was stifling to her. And as a matter of fact, at one point in her care, I told her, I was like, I think something that would really help you. And if you could picture this lady, super sweet lady, would never probably even raise her voice above a certain octave. I told her at some point, I was like, I said, I think something that would really help you. If you could find a field that you could go out into to where nobody could hear you, so you wouldn't be affecting anybody and nobody would think anything about you, and you could just yell and scream at the top of your lungs and really let out all the things that you're holding down inside, I think it would be a major factor in shifting your healthcare. Because along with growing up the way that I did, I was very introverted, very quiet, but I also was an intense feeler. When I look back on my childhood, especially with the training I have now, I could feel tons of things. I could feel things in my environment. I could feel things around people. I could feel things really coming off of people. And so that's served me well in my clinical role, because a lot of times people don't necessarily want to say what's really bothering them. And a lot of times I can feel aspects of that, or at least the conflict there, that can open up more of a dialogue. And I would say that patients that have seen me in the past are probably the most intrigued with the way that I can explain certain functions of the nervous system relative to how emotions are affecting them, or conflict in their life, stress in their relationships, job, their overall viewpoint, fears. And so I've been able to link that aspect of nervous system function with the ability that I see that the nervous system has to coordinate function in body structure for the purposes of dissipating things that don't belong and aligning that person actually to more life. So, how it tied into the biblical narrative for me, there's a couple of quick things, but one, at one point I was in a small town in Virginia, and a buddy of mine was there, and somebody introduced us to a guy that he did some martial arts training and various things, but he also was teaching classes on the Bible. And when I looked into what he was teaching, I was like, man, I wasn't 100% sure of the guy in the first place, but I mean, some of the things he was saying was intriguing. But it was my first exposure to where somebody was trying to tie in Eastern aspects of like reincarnation and things like that within the biblical narrative. And I didn't really, coming from a small town in Mississippi, that was unheard of for me. And so the more I kind of listened to it, I was like, well, maybe there's a lot of things I don't really know. And so as I moved from there, back into an area close to where I grew up in Mississippi, I'd really just started spending more and more time reading the Bible on my own, something that, we were kind of forced to do growing up, but never from this perspective. And I remember, and I'm saying all this, and I think some of the audience may be able to relate with this, but I ran across in my personal study, Matthew 10. And as I read it, I saw it and I was like, and as I interpreted it, it said, the group of people that were being addressed, you shall not have completed going over the cities of Israel until I've returned. Well, I was like, what is this? And at the time, I was coming from a background, that early Baptist background. We got shown films of the rapture, essentially, probably 2 or 3 times a year. I mean, people, blinking out of cars and motorcycles running off the road, just nobody being left, essentially, that were raptured out. And when I read that, I was like, and then, and this is, this is just kind of how my mind was processing stuff. I was like, oh my God, I mean, what if some of that stuff I got exposed to from some of those people in Virginia about reincarnation, what if that's true? And so I so didn't want to let go of that futurist perspective that I started going, well, could this mean that people could possibly be reincarnated at the time that it was time for Christ to return? And, and in that, that would kind of still keep the futurist mindset, but it would reconcile what I was just now reading in Matthew 10. And it started me, down a path. And I started asking, I started having meetings with several pastors in the area that I was in at the time. And of course, I'm probably starting my 3rd year of clinical practice in this new area of Mississippi. It's very similar to where I grew up, pretty close-minded to most things. And of course, I mean, everybody kind of wanted to indoctrinate you on their view, but they didn't seem to be interested in addressing what I was asking. And so eventually it brought me into some different, I guess, kind of synchronous events. And my father and stepmother were attending a church that a guy was a Presbyterian minister. And the reason this story matters is because there's little pieces in there that point toward there's something happening for a reason. So regardless of what emerges out of this dialogue today, I don't want anybody to lose sight on maybe we all are being brought into something bigger and clearer. And it's not really going to involve loss, but we may have to view things from a different lens. So anyway, this particular pastor, he was a Presbyterian minister, seminary trained minister, and he had been kicked out of the Presbyterian church system for starting to teach on the gifts of the Spirit. Now, what was interesting about that was the bylaws or whatever was involved in that Presbyterian church system essentially had no rules against teaching about the gifts of the Spirit, but they were not okay with anybody carrying them out as if you were in a more of a Pentecostal, some type of charismatic church system, Assembly of God, something along those roles. And so essentially there were people from some charismatic churches that were starting to flock to him to listen to him, and they didn't really know why. And I thought, well, this guy has an interesting story, but it cost him his ministry with the Presbyterian system because they had somebody show up from kind of the higher ups, and they were dissatisfied even with the way that he was teaching. And he was very clear that he was not trying to tell people, oh, you better do this or that. But I think some of the influence from some of the people that were attending, not by his choice, just they felt led to come to him. He got kicked out of the Presbyterian church system as a result of that, which I thought was fascinating. And then he ended up starting some of his own churches, as time went on. And by the time that I met him, there had been several different church splits the way he talked about it. And I think that's a pretty common thing within a lot of churches is, somebody decides, oh, I don't like this particular view, and they start their own other thing or whatever. And so in that, I continue to hear people in his church that would kind of, and they would make a reference to, well, we're not like dispensationalists. And I was going, what the heck is that? So all these things I would hear, I would go try to read about, because they were, some of them were new to me. And finally, a lady in the church, she could kind of tell I was trying to figure out, well, where were they different? They seem to be so different, but where? And she gave me a book of I believe it was Robert Chilton's The Days of Vengeance. And she's like, if you read this, it'll give you better understanding. So I'm kind of, making my way through that book partially and still trying to attend church there as I could. And I ended up kind of researching some things on my own. And through a Google search, ran across some aspects of preterism. And through my study, of course, at this point, I mean, I've got a lifetime of studying things. And so I knew how to kind of pursue it. And I was like, okay, so it looks like there's a kind of a full preterist view and a partial preterist view. And the name Don Preston came up, and I was like, man, I was hungry to try to understand. I wanted to understand where this church that I had gotten thrown into, so to speak, through familial type, synchronicity. How did that tie in? And so I actually found a phone number for the guy, and I reached out to him. And I was like, man, this is, and he answered. I don't know how that came to pass, but I kind of told him, how I had stumbled upon his number, and and the conversation kind of went, I was kind of like, well, if you're right, I was like, what's the point of being a Christian? Like, in other words, what's the big to do about it? How does your view change anything? And it kind of concluded that, I really never could tell exactly why he thought it was a benefit, at least in that phone conversation, other than, that you didn't have to worry about essentially, all the things like I would have been shown in those films growing up about the rapture. And I thought, okay, I'll just kind of go with that. And at the time I was kind of like, well, what about the part on, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 15, regarding an objective pronoun regarding the body. It, is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. And I thought, gosh, that's, what about that? And of course, I didn't really know what I believed, but it looked like to me, that there was something more to it than what he was saying. And I didn't argue with him, but I'm pretty passionate when I am on a search, and I pushed him a little bit, and man, I don't know. Next thing I know, he hung up the phone on me. And I mean, it could have been going on in his life. So it's not anything against him personally, but who knows? He could have been getting a lot of flack. Now that I've kind of been on this journey and see what happens on Facebook, who knows? Maybe somebody had said something to him, right before that. But I was kind of like, man, I can't believe that guy just did that. I don't know why would he do that? And so but it started me asking more questions at that church I was at. And eventually the pastor there, I think he felt threatened by some of the questions, because the more I studied, I started asking them. I was like, I'm kind of understanding this thing about full preterism a little more. I mean, where in the biblical narrative are you getting that Christ is going to ever come back again in any capacity? Because believe it or not, this little church, even though they weren't dispensationalists, they somehow believed that Christ was going to return in the future. And somebody picked up on it in that church group, and they began to kind of fuel almost a type of conflict between myself and the pastor. And I grew, the more I studied, I was like, well, I just don't see any evidence that there's, if you believe that it's already done and you're not a partial preterist, I just don't see any evidence. I don't see it written anywhere where Christ is going to return again. So how would you go down? How would you get that information? And so he was preaching one Sunday, and he decided out of kind of all this conflict to start addressing some things. And he taught on Matthew 24 and talked about how there were people out there that tried to divide up Matthew 24. Halfway through, it's already fulfilled, and the rest of half is yet to be fulfilled. And I just basically asked him in the church service, I was like, well, do you split it up like that? Or do you believe it's all, it's already done? In other words, it's a consistent narrative there. And he goes, no, we don't split it. We believe it's a consistent narrative. And I was like, well, then where is there any evidence that Christ is going to do anything else? And I mean, man, he ultimately got frustrated in front of his whole congregation and asked me to leave. And I'm telling you, I was not challenging him. I was not, other than asking the questions. But I remember that particular day, and I remember that there was such a calm that had come over me. It was like something was inducing the calm that I was not in control of. And I don't know how to explain that. All I know is that I was not nervous. I was not, I did not really, I could see that the conflict was brewing, but I mean, up until the point he asked me to leave. And I tell you, being asked to leave and standing up and walking out of a church service in front of a bunch of people, that wasn't that comfortable. I got to tell you, I remember getting into my car and thinking, what just happened here? But that kind of started my journey. And then after that, I studied as much of Don Preston's stuff on YouTube as I could, and ended up having a couple of conversations with Michael Miano, and really just trying to figure out what I had stumbled into. And then from there, I guess the next step was, seeing how I don't know which, and Tristan can clarify all this, but I got exposed to Michael Bradley, Michael Barris, and and then I didn't talk to Jason DaCosta personally, but some of the videos they were putting out, and I started going, wow, this IO view is kind of intriguing. I mean, that seems to support that it's already done, but then where do we fit? And it's just been this crazy journey. But for me, it's been a nice fit because it's working through conflict myself. And I think ultimately, when I achieve the clarity that I'm seeking, it will help me better serve my patient population. Not that I discuss the Bible with very many of them, but I can tell you that in the area that I'm in, people's religious conflict is playing a massive role in certain aspects of their bodily dysfunction. There is no question about it. I see it all the time. I've taught for a company for the last 2.5 years that they asked me to put together a program to teach other doctors. And it was essentially a program on empowering doctors and empowering patients by looking at the role of mechanical stability, neurological control, and consciousness. And in that, essentially, the autonomic nervous system plays a huge role in that. And that is the system that is very expressive based on fears, beliefs, conflicts. And so a lot of unresolved stuff in people is triggering to their autonomic nervous system. And in a lot of cases, that can create dysregulation in other systems, especially in the immune system. And so you can start to see patterns of where when people are in major conflict with who they are, and maybe the religious piece of the puzzle is driving that, I've seen that express in multiple autoimmune disorders. So, I mean, I think this is a bigger deal than people understand. Most other doctors don't talk to people about this. And we're in an age where, autoimmune, or at least named autoimmune disorders, are on the rise. And I mean, you can't turn on the TV without seeing the pharmaceutical industry, promoting some type of biologic agent that essentially suppresses T cell function in general. And they're trying to suppress that aspect of immune function because it's overactive. Well, why is it overactive? It's overactive because it thinks that it needs to be, and it needs to be because the system is in dysregulation, and a system that's not balanced will have either too much function somewhere, or it will have shutdown of function somewhere. And that, in my opinion, is the key to real diagnosis of what's going on with somebody, not just naming diseases. So that's essentially my long-winded way of giving a little bit about how I grew up and how I've ended up here. I'm clearer than ever on my clinical model. So it doesn't matter who shows up at my office. I have ways at getting at where their body system dysfunctions are and what in their life may be facilitating that. And so for me, as I mentioned to Tristan, my driving factor in this, I have a true desire to tell people the truth, whatever it is. I mean, I get people that come from other doctors or whatever different background they're coming from. And a whole lot of times my ability to clarify something for them plays a huge role in not only shifting their body physiology, but the road they're on in life. So I don't take it lightly that I'm in a position of authority that could greatly affect people. And I'm usually not satisfied unless I feel very comfortable that I'm coming from a perspective of truth. And so that's the big reason for me in trying to resolve the biblical narrative, because I think it's affecting people. I feel like I'm in a position that through my dialogue and my clinical giftings, that I can actually facilitate a better life for somebody. And it's not trying to, wreck the apple cart for anybody, but it's really trying to say that there may be a deep reason why the truth sets us all free. It just may not be what everybody thinks.
Oh,
So,
perfect. Well, thank you, Dr. Cox. That was absolutely amazing, very thorough. And we connected when it came to, critiquing the Pristonian view of the resurrection, as they have claimed it to be a spiritual change, a moral change, something that would involve their neurological properties, something that would involve the nervous system. And so, could you, give us some of your insights on critiquing this covenantal resurrection, this metaphoric language that we've discussed previously? Could you share your thoughts on this? And if we can consider some of Don Preston's responses in his last debate, he stated that the saints all throughout the world were dancing in the streets, and this was the experiential factor to the change to immortality. This was the physical reaction to meeting Christ in the air, which he claims to be metaphoric language. So, could you give some of your honest opinions, even critiques,
yeah.
on this spiritual resurrection, since he denies the rapture, correct? What's your insight on this? What would be your critiques?
Well, and that's I'm gonna see if I can think of a way to not get overly deep into, because the reason why is because it's rich in that you can look at it from a model in which, and all of us have had this experience where when we're under some type of stress or a strong fear pattern, and that fear gets relieved, that has profound changes in the nervous system. There's
Wow.
zero doubt about it. I see it every day. So if you're, and of course, I really, it's taken me a while to understand that whole concept of like a covenantal or a type of, it almost sounds like, well, something happened, but the only response that people would have was because their persecutors were freed, and or they were freed from their persecutors. And I mean, I you know I don't have a problem with there being an effect in people by being freed from their persecutors, but when I look at the narrative, it seems like to me that everything is pushing toward a dramatic change in being.
Yes.
It's not just escaping your persecutors. It's and I believe I sent you the thing on Philippians 3, right? And
Yeah.
so and we would have to see where that view. I'm not really sure, and maybe how they describe when Paul addresses that he can't wait to have this glorious body, like it seems to be that he got exposed to on the road to Damascus, and get rid of this vile body, right? I mean, what would be his reference point to vile body? I mean, it seems like that's a major stretch to me to somehow be to make a vile body like a body of knowledge or some type of group phenomenon. I mean,
Corporate body is what they
yeah, I mean,
say, yeah.
even if you're discussing a corporate, a group, and that was another thing I think that kind of got reiterated to me when I was looking into the IO perspective, at least from Michael Bradley and that group, is that when I was looking at the things that they were saying, I was like, man, and in my own mind, I didn't necessarily just jump on full bore, but I thought, golly, man, this is just, it sure got there's a lot of language that's geared toward that Israel only type thing. And I deal with that a lot around here. And then we'll tie this back into some of what the full preterist view is today, because if I'm understanding correctly from a lot of them, even from the dialogue that Don Preston had with me in the last little exchange we had, I guess a week and a half ago, whatever it was. But I mean, I think he asked in there, are people still dying today? Are people still sinning today and things like that? I'm going like, man, I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, people are dying and people are sinning depending on, I guess how you view that. But if you view it as a a violation of law of some sort. And I just had a situation where, and I think this will give a little clarity to people, because when I think about things from a real world perspective, it helps me make sense of what I've learned about these different covenant language pieces. But let's say you're in a new relationship, and maybe that person has done something in the past that you don't approve of, right? Well, if you're unhappy with it and you're condemning the behavior, you're only able to condemn that behavior based on a law that you're proposing. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, in other words, it's what you make law relative to events that give you the power to condemn or uncondemn anything. And I thought, man, it's an awful lot like that. So when you look at that from a perspective of, in the fullness of time, or kairos, I believe in the Greek is that appointed time versus chronos. God sent his son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, to condemn sin in the flesh. So if Christ condemned sin in the flesh, and you really experience that, why would you still be sinning? So if people were left behind and that was kind of a covenant type thing, are they not able to sin anymore just simply because the old covenant system has been destroyed? I mean, they're probably going to live like the rest of us. I mean, based on their personality and what have you, they're going to do good or bad things.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that when that Paul in Romans 7 seems to suggest that there's something in him left over from an ancestral pattern that he can't help but be at the mercy of it. The things he did not want to do, he couldn't help from doing, and the things he wanted to do, he couldn't find the strength to do.
It was a psychological struggle as well. I mean,
and it seemed like to me, and again, I'm at the point where I really don't know who wrote it all, and that's the honest truth. I really don't know. To me, there's a lot of consistency in the narrative. Like, I mean, at one time, I felt like my faith in the Christian model was strengthened, because the more I read the New Testament, I was like, oh my God, this goes with this and that goes with that. And it just all seems like a seamless thing. And that seamlessness for me was somebody showed up, showed them a different way, showed them that they had to come into a different identity in order to be free.
Right. And there was an expectation of a final consummation. When we read the change to immortality in the twinkling of an eye, that was like how you mentioned before, a dramatic event. Okay. And so I've often criticized the covenant full preterists on what happened to the saints living hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the temple. How did they experience that cognitively, in their conscious reality? And of course, the meeting with Christ in the air with the dead, which the full preterists have stated that the dead were in Hades, and that they had a change of location. They changed from Hades, and they were somehow raptured up into heaven. So they had an ontological change of location from Hades to heaven. So again, getting back to the question about the covenantal change, would you say that, let's say if it was some sort of spiritual resurrection, which they have identified as a moral perfection. So you're talking about sinning. And the full preterist camp has been criticized heavily over the years about sinning after 70 AD. If they're morally perfect, and by the way, this critique will never go away so long as covenant full preterist eschatology exists. Well, after they were made perfected, or after they were made, quote, immortal, after they had, quote, met Christ in the air, how was their moral perfection effective? I mean, were they able to sin at all? We've always been taught that when you get taken up into a rapture like event, or you're in heaven, you're going to have an immortal body fashioned like the body of Christ. And that since Christ is sinless, since he is perfected, since he's immortal, we would be like that as well. So my question is, and I've often criticized Don directly when he states that there's no physical reaction. There was no physics involved. This is strictly spiritual. And so
I find that to be absolutely impossible.
Okay, please explain why.
100% impossible, because so let's say that, and again, I've seen a lot of things in 25 plus years of clinical practice. I've experienced a lot of things in my own spiritual journey in which I've had changes in how I felt about things, how I saw things that I struggled with getting resolved for sure, not maybe, and having major change. So those are on the level that I'm operating on. So imagine that something has been put inside of you that is making you at one level conformable to Christ's death, but also with the hope of the power of his resurrection. Even Paul said that. He said that, that I might attain. So there was something that he saw that made him want what he saw. Simple as that. It's not, I don't think he read something somewhere. I mean, in the narrative, I mean, I guarantee you, if any of us had an experience with some ascended being and we saw the glory of what they brought to the table, I mean, whatever that was, whether it was their presence or
Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem was that glory, is what the full preterist camp have stated. As the same way the Father came in the Old Testament, he was supposed to come in the New Testament, like Father, like Son, in clouds of glory.
So I don't think that would be would be enough to motivate Paul to write those
right
the way he did. Because what do you get out of that? I mean, if I found out that my hometown was going to be destroyed tomorrow, and maybe something in my hometown was persecuting me or whatever, I think everybody, if they're honest with themselves, if you've got something that is after you or causing you great angst in your life and then it goes away, there's a part of you, even if there's suffering involved for other people, there's a part of you that is joyful. So I don't discount the idea that they're talking about there. Of course, I didn't live back then, so I don't know to what degree suffering would occur. But I think to extend that forward, to deny that there was some type of glory in some type of physical change, some type of experiential change, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, because there's a lot of references to like being clothed with that body which is from heaven. I mean, why would you want that? Like, what would be the point? Like, why would there be and I see that here, where when people are suffering in their health and they really don't see a lot of hope, their views are, I can't wait to get out of here and get to heaven. It's because they have a view that it's going to be way better than what they're experiencing. So that to me is the reference point.
Yeah, and the full preterist camp state that we're in the new heavens and the new earth. And so there is really no expectation of this being reformed, the existence of evil, which Sam Frost left full preterism because of the existence of evil. He's stated before, if evil exists in the new heavens and new earth, that would make God a liar. He even stated, grab your Bible, throw it away in the trash. And so I guess what I'm saying is that if there is a spiritual, well, let me ask you, if there's a spiritual experience, does that not involve physics on the cellular quantum level? Does that not demand some sort of physical reaction, cognitively a physical reaction, an enlightenment, some sort of experiential phenomena? Just like when you read people who receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit, there was physical reactions galore, speaking in tongues, prophesying. Even people today, when they believe that they've received the Holy Spirit, there's physical reactions. They cry. They feel an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude, which highly esteemed epistemologists, I'll name Alvin Plantinga as one of them, that they use the epistemology of religious experience and neuroscience to prove God's existence. They use this within their arguments to prove intelligent design. So would you agree that if anybody has a spiritual experience, a moral perfection, that would at least involve some sort of physical reaction? Would they feel goosebumps? Would they cry tears of joy? Would they shake? Would they fall into a trance? Maybe they fall into a stoic, meditated state. So would you agree that if somebody was supposed to have a spiritual resurrection, we're granting it if the full preterists are true, that if they had a spiritual resurrection, would that not demand 100% a physical involvement and reaction?
I think they would be expressing through their nervous system differently. And if it were still happening today, you would still be expressing yourself differently through your nervous system. It's impossible to have received something and it be making a change in you, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
not have expressive change neurologically, but just a simple thing that when you experience more joy, a whole lot of times that comes with postural changes. It comes with changes in your facial affect. You hold your shoulders differently.
Wow.
And that affects the autonomic nervous system, which is going to affect reproductive function, cortisol levels, digestive, function. Like you really can't separate those things out.
I have to interject really quickly. I have to interject really quickly. This question about facial expressions and physical reaction, there is a full preterist out there that debates. And Steve, he literally said that, the saints may have experienced indigestion when it came to the changed immortality. And it's very comical, but it's also serious. Because oftentimes the full preterists talk about the Hebraic mind,
Yeah.
And when you read the Old Testament, many times facial expressions were a part of the story. You look at Cain, why does your countenance fall? Even Sarah and Hagar, the Bible says that Hagar looked at her a certain way. And so I'm just trying to get into the Hebraic mind. When I ask, well, what were the facial expressions when they changed to immortality? And this is where Don stated that he was really sure that there was some dancing. And were they shedding tears? And he said that, yes, I think in a way they probably were. So here's the imagery, the mental imagery. You have saints that are crying and dancing, which is something very similar to the Pentecostal system of worship. Pentecostals oftentimes express themselves, and they believe cognitively in their mind that they are having a spiritual experience. So I'm glad you said that, Steve. Brian, I see that you're here. Would you like to interject or ask any questions? I think that you had stated before in the past that you had a seminary professor who was very keen to neuroscience, and that neuroscience was something of the future. Is there anything you would like to give as far as input?
Yeah, I just I'll ask a question in just one moment, but yeah, the seminary professor, he said that within modern theological history, evolution was like the first big theological breakthrough, and neuroscience will be the next. He said this for, I think it was around 2017. So I guess my question would be, and it's kind of piggybacking off of what Tristan said, um, like in verses which would seem to indicate that there's going to be some kind of cognitive change at the consummation, like we will see him as he is, we will know even as we are known. This is something that would absolutely have to involve some kind of brain chemistry, right? I mean, we're not talking about people coming along 2,000 years later and saying, whoa, they missed it. This would have to be something where if it was actually missed, you would actually be looking more at, say, non-fulfillment or failed fulfillment, wouldn't you? Can't really get around the language and say, well, you could have this kind of fulfillment without any kind of experiential or at least cognitive manifestation, can you?
I don't think you can have any of that stuff without cognitive manifestation. I mean, one area of research that I've been involved in is the effect of certain structural changes in the body with its effects on an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex and certain aspects of the prefrontal cortex are uniquely human. I mean, even the great apes don't have the detail that we have in that regard. And what's interesting is there's other areas of the brain that are kind of classified as the limbic system areas of the brain that are dealing with threat in your environment, competitive threat. And it's a different kind of threat than like your leg getting cut and you starting to bleed. There's deep areas of the brainstem, really, in some circles would be called the reptilian brain. And the reason being is because even reptiles have that part. And it's very much a part that's based on regulation of breathing and blood pressure and and core survival functions. These areas of the limbic structures, you can actually be threatened in your environment and it can activate those reptilian brain areas, but there not be a real threat. It's crazy. I mean, in other words, there is a real threat if you base it off of survival. If you bleed out enough, there's a real threat there. But a lot of things are perceived threat. And and this will tie into what I think you're getting at. But I had a guy in California that does a lot of stuff with, things with mind. And he said to me one time, he said, remember this. He said that, this is a pretty common thought out there. Somebody could potentially challenge it, but I think it's pretty consistent in certain circles that there'd be some truth to this, that from age 0 to 7 or 8, we're all very much like a subconscious mind. I mean, we're just getting things fed to us, and our minds and brains are developing based on that environmental influence. And he said, look, that aspect of mind is affected by 3 factors: trauma, repetition, and authority figures. And the reason this is key is because we're all exposed to authority figures and we're getting imprinted with things early on. And then repetitive thought, repetitive messages. And then here's where the trauma piece comes into play. The world's leading trauma specialists all pretty much agree that the trauma response in human beings is coupled with some element of the value you place on the event, coupled with inescapability. In other words, you can't get away from it, right? So think about growing up in an environment where you're told you're going to go to a dark, murky place, or you're going to go here or there, or even, whatever your culture is. I'm telling you, you can be trapped by fears of the unknown in ways that 100% acts through your nervous system. So if you come into a state of consciousness, so let's just say that the people that changed in a twinkling of an eye at the parousia remained in the earth, right? But they had a change in knowingness, right? You can't, it's not going to be just nothingness. I mean, even if they had the same body that they had prior to the parousia, it's not going to be nothingness. There's going to be some profound shift in their consciousness, which is going to have changes in how they carry themselves, how they view things for the future. And to me, you would have enough people, even if it, like what Tristan says, if they're not in a close enough area to be directly affected by the events of the destruction of the temple, if everybody in that group had that same ingredient, AKA they had received the Spirit and the Spirit was doing a work in them until the day of Christ, just like the narrative says, then that they are going to start having changes even before the parousia. I mean, that's the big thing that I get when I'm talking to even modern day Catholics and Protestants in this area. I'm like, have any of you ever looked at the part about that Christ is coming for a glorious and spotless body? I was like, do you not think that involves doing anything? Like, I mean, to me, that's basically saying all of us are supposed to be having something work in us, and it's clear that we are all changing. I mean, it's clear. It's not like, I said 5 curse words this week and not 10. I'm talking about like, these are changes in your being that are leading you up to an event that's probably not going to take you by surprise. To me, it's impossible to be fueled by some source that's increasing your ability to know, and then this thing's just going to take you by accident, or nobody's going to know anything. To me, it's just silly the more that I think about it. And so when you look at it from that perspective and you translate it to 2,000 years ago or whatever, I would make the case that those people were being prepared at a very powerful level. And so if it is more of a critical mass type, 100th monkey type phenomena, where, Christ is entering or is influential in not only the judgment component, but the transformative component. If I read Matthew 24 correctly, I mean, it's essentially immediately after those days, start looking for this and that. And like, Jesus's comments to Peter is like, when you see all this kind of stuff, look up, for your redemption draweth near. Well, why are you going to look up? Well, I mean, what's the point of that? Like, I mean, that, what are redemption from what? Right. And so, I mean, there's just a lot of things to me that if the narrative is you are justified by believing, just like Abraham, you're justified because you're believing God. And in this particular case, you're believing the word of God in Christ. So you're believing, that's justification. Now you've received the Spirit, and the Spirit's doing a work in you leading up to the parousia that is actually clearing things. It's sanctifying you. It's making changes in you already, which are going to have neurobiological constituents to them.
That's correct.
I mean, I don't think that. I think it's impossible to have that without having neurobiological change. And then the third phase would be glorification. So I see that as a preparatory event in which there's no way that you're going to see Christ as he is if he's in a glorified state, if you don't come in that same glorified state. Now, if you stick around and you think that glorified state allows you to also stay in this dimension, then you're probably going to have capabilities like Christ had post-resurrection, walking, entering into a room that the doors were locked, and somebody could change from, the disciples going like, oh my gosh, we thought we saw a ghost. Okay, well, that's obviously some kind of change in a state of matter. Like if you look like a ghost, you're not going to look like a three-dimensional being per se, but then he collapses down further or turns the rheostat down, if you want to use that kind of language a little bit. And he says, hey, come and touch me. Does a ghost have flesh and bone as you feel me have? Well, how does somebody go from, looking like an apparition to having flesh and bone? So there's all these different elements. So to me, there's a lot of preparatory activity showing, hey, this is what the kingdom of God looks like. The kingdom of God is different than how you've grown up from, your childhood up to now. It's different. I'm representative of it. So it seems silly to me that those same attributes would not be continued if somebody existed post, 70 AD, if we're using that as a timeline.
Wow. Well, it's, Don has compared Elisha's servant when he tapped into the unseen realm. He's compared the parousia of 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4. And he stated, even his debate with Mark Smith on Myth Vision podcast, that it was in the invisible realm. And this is another critique that this covenant full preterist view of the resurrection is always going to face. It happened in the unseen realm. It happened in the invisible realm. And it was like when Elisha's servant tapped into the unseen realm. Well, Steve, when somebody taps into the unseen realm and they're looking at the transcendent world, the spiritual world, and Elisha saw the chariot army surrounding him, would that not involve the visual cortex of the brain? Maybe perhaps Elisha was in some sort of hypnotic state, but regardless of what it was, he still had to process that spiritual information in the unseen realm and then remember it, which would involve the hippocampus of the brain. So that way he could live to tell about it. And that's why we're reading it in the Bible, because how else did people know? Well, he had to have processed that information, and it still had to cross the domain of the brain in order for him to understand this. So I'm
not
glad
to mention the comfort factor. The comfort factor in that.
Yes. Comfort one another with these words. Yes.
Well, the comfort factor in that, at least if I remember the reference point there, I mean, he realizes he's not alone. I mean, if I were facing something that I could see in this plane of existence, and all of a sudden God opened my eyes and I saw that I was backed by this heavenly army and there was nothing to worry about, it would change my state of being.
Yeah.
And that state of being is through mind, brain, and then there's a bodily expression of that change.
Well, yeah, it would be like, when Moses, when he saw the tail end of the glory of God, his face shone.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the Hebraic mind here. This is what I'm saying. Many times the full preterists like to go to the Old Testament and
Yeah.
reference it as the Hebraic mind. Well,
Yeah.
this is the Hebraic mind. This is what
Yeah.
happened to Moses
But
when
they
he
saw
saw.
that glow, correct? I mean, the people that saw Moses, they saw that
They
glow.
saw that glow, right?
Yeah.
And Sam Frost, in his debate with Ward Finley, which I respect Ward Finley very much, but many have criticized, well, if you're glorified, are you shining like the sun? And it's funny, but it's this tasseling with this metaphoric language here. They oftentimes say metaphoric language and then spiritual language, which I believe they're not necessarily the same. If I'm saying a metaphor, I'm not involving a spiritual ontology in the transcendent world. I'm not necessarily involving that. So let's get back to some of your questions with Don when you interacted with him, and you brought about the covenantal body view. What can you give more insight on that, and what were some of the arguments that you were making that got him to what you had stated? He hung up on you, or
Yeah, I mean, I think he just, I mean, if I had, and of course he could speak to this if he even remembers it. It was so long ago, but I'm guessing it was because I was pressing the bodily change component, and let me just state my why in this, because that could have influenced things. I get why they come from where they do, and I also am not opposed to something happening in the unseen. Like, I mean, but to me, if you're experiencing the unseen, you're not going to be left unchanged.
exactly.
If somebody else is not experiencing the unseen, they may not have the change. So I think I was fixated on the time because I thought, gosh, what an amazing thing of how Christianity can separate itself from what a lot of Eastern religions have so pursued. I mean, there's different aspects of various Eastern religions that seek transcendental states or ascended masters. There's all kind of stuff out there, and I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, what if good old Christianity, just like I grew up in the Baptist church in a small town, Mississippi, what if it has all of that? And all we've got to do is just accept it, So I was operating from the perspective of biological change. And I think he was getting frustrated that it doesn't require biological change.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I didn't even know enough at the time to see where we might be at odds. I don't think he knew where I was coming from. But so, in that regard, I don't really know. I don't know how to address it more than, to me, any kind of spiritual phenomena that any of us could be being exposed to today, it should have a correlating bodily expressive component at some level, because other than that, why change? I mean, even if you're only removing fears, because of everything that I've looked in these 25 plus years of clinical practice, I mean, people's fears are creating all kind of biochemical changes that are adding to chronic disease. So, I mean, if I have spiritual change and it makes it so that I literally don't have any of those fears anymore, then that is a huge component of bodily breakdown biochemically that I'm no longer going to be experiencing. I'm adding years to my life just from that.
Wow.
There's zero. I would stake my entire career on that fact.
Wow.
But the question becomes is, what does it take to have those spiritual experiences that produce bodily change, which is what I'm in pursuit of. Okay. And how does it tie in with the narrative? Because if I'm understanding where you're going with this, is that the covenant eschatology view is basically saying, well, you can have all that changed and not have physical change.
Right.
That's right.
They make the mistake and I believe it's very fledgling, very novice. They even have stated that it was a moral change. And when you do studies on moral changes, like if somebody converts to Christianity, you brought up the prefrontal cortex. There is literally a change in the physical brain. And that involves physical reactions. Like if somebody is studying math, for example, their brain is having strain trying to understand formulas in the arithmetic. But when they finally understand the math problem, and I've seen this in students in my experience in education, that when they finally understand a math problem, there's like a eureka moment, right?
Yep.
There's like an enlightenment. And so I think that this boils down to like what I've said in the past, the experiential factor of this fulfillment. Since they are denying a rapture, then what in the world took place? And I'm so grateful that you're able to expound on this in your experience and clinical studies and clinical practice. Because this is what makes it practical. If you're going to go to Bible college or seminary, you have to take courses on practical theology, which is what is the practicalities of this whole covenantal change, spiritual change. And I think that this answer from Don, who I respect very much. I mean, he took a very controversial view and brought it to a world-class level. He stated that the saints were dancing in the streets, and I think that that is completely untenable when exegeting 1 Corinthians 15. You mean to say that the mental images when Paul wrote this, and the mental images of the first century audience when they read changed immortality, that they were thinking about dancing in the streets when the Roman soldiers came and besieged Jerusalem, that when they read the meeting of Christ in the air with the dead, that the mental image when they read these texts, these propositions, was dancing in the streets when they experienced the relief of their persecutors. And, women were cooking their children for 5 months. This was a terrible event. And Don has stated that I have perverted what he had stated. I'm not perverting what he is stating. During that 5-month besiegement of Jerusalem, that Christ came in clouds of glory, and that was the coming of the Lord. That was the judgment. And during that time, 5 months, the saints were dancing in the streets. That was the causal factor. And so I'm really appreciative that you have taken this time to confirm some of these studies, especially that which is concerning neuroscience, which is empirical data. There are full preterists who follow the Pristonian theology, and they don't even want to talk about neuroscience as if it doesn't exist. And that it has nothing to do with the Bible, when if anybody had a brain in the Bible, it would involve neuroscience. You know what I mean? So it's
I don't think you can have true spiritual experience without it changing the brain.
That's absolutely, and it's
I don't think it's possible.
Well,
Now,
I mean,
if you're talking about some type of transitional physics, theoretically, I think it's probably possible for your consciousness to be shifted into some other domain, right? I mean, it's just like, and I don't know if this is the perfect example, but in the movie Avatar, for example, in the end, they transferred his consciousness into a body that was more like the native people that he was connected to, and the girl he got connected with. And so, you have to wonder, like when Paul says, about longing to be clothed with that body which is from heaven. I mean, he's pretty clear that there is the natural body, which he saw everybody walking around with, and there was something else, because from what I can tell in the narrative, his first real exposure to Christ is in a glorified state.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't go tell King Agrippa, like, oh my gosh, that everybody would be a Christian. I mean, I saw this dude that shone brighter than the noonday sun. I mean, that's not metaphoric language. I mean, if somebody saw me and they saw me on one weekend, like, man, he was so happy. It was like he was shining like the sun. Yeah. I mean, that didn't mean they saw a change in my affect.
Right.
But if they had seen me and like, I don't know, man, that was weirded me out. I saw him and he didn't look normal. I mean, matter of fact, I'm not sure what it was, but all I can tell you is it looked like light. Wow. I mean, they're going to wonder about that. Anybody absolutely. That's watching this, or either one of us, if I saw somebody at night that glowed like the noonday sun, I
Right.
would be like, hey, what is that? Right.
Yes,
And I
but
think that,
there's still a physical application to these metaphors. So I've granted it to the full preterists that Paul was being metaphoric. Let's say that, and that's exactly what they state, that he was using metaphoric language. But there is still a physical involvement and a physical reaction and application to these metaphors, especially when you tie a metaphor to a spiritual experience. Now, if you want to keep it strictly metaphor, then you could further develop that argument. But the moment you tie that metaphor with a spiritual experience, which the spirit of a man is intrinsic with the brain, if you're alive, and those that were dead in Hades, they were to experience some sort of metaphoric event together with the living. And this is why I've always focused on the living saints, on what they experienced.
yeah.
I think in the
You
past,
mean post parousia, correct? The
yes,
living saints.
or just the actual the metasecond of fulfillment when Christ returned into the time and space
Yeah.
continuum, not as a 5'5" Jewish man, but he
Yeah.
returned by means of the Roman armies torturing women and children
Mhm.
for 5 months. I mean, there's no way to beautify this when the Roman soldiers are torturing. We often talked about the persecutors. Well, these children that were in the Jerusalem gates, they did not persecute Christians. The women who were, unfortunately having to cook their children, what Jesus said, woe unto those who give suck in those days. There's no biblical evidence of women and children over here persecuting Christians, especially those living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So, even if he was being metaphoric, there is still an experiential factor to this that the living saints had to have engaged in consciously, to cognitively process this information and then realize and know that they are now made perfect or immortal.
Well,
Yeah.
so the reason I want to say this is because I see where the metaphoric piece comes into play. And so if somebody to counter my view came back and said, well, Steve, if somebody's dead in their trespasses and sins, are they still drawing breath? I would say, yeah, more than likely. So if somebody's dead in their trespasses and sins, to me, that's where that that shame element, that element of I see people all the time that come to see me as patients that they are still breathing to get here, but to look at them, they look more dead than they do alive.
Well, that's the covenantal death is what
Yeah,
they have
yeah.
stated.
But the thing about it, from what I can understand, is all that stuff is because of the effects it has on somebody. It's not just something that's written. Okay, you're in violation of, so therefore it's a mark against you in eternity. Like it had elements connected to it that was causing problems. I mean, otherwise, why would there be so much language about being held captive? I mean, when Jesus is referencing, being set free, free from what? I mean, they weren't all in jail. They were captive relative to their thinking, let's say.
Yeah,
So
it
if
was
somebody's dead,
involved their neuropsychology. It involved their neuropsychology.
yeah. And so
Yes.
if somebody becomes undead, okay, because they're no longer in their trespasses and sins,
Yes.
that is going to have an affectual change.
Absolutely.
And you can't have affectual change without neuroscience.
Right.
I mean,
And allow me to interject. The full preterist camp, they state, well, this being set free, translating from darkness into his marvelous light. They go, there's no physical darkness, which darkness actually does have physical properties now, scientists have detected, and light also has physical properties, but he wasn't being physical. But that was the born again experience, from being translated from darkness into his marvelous light. When people hear the gospel message, it affects them psychologically. It touches them in their nervous system, where just like how you brought in the past, the body senses fear,
Yeah.
People with a sense of fear of judgment, or, we call it
Yeah.
a holy fear,
Yeah.
and are drawn to God in
Right.
love. They get
Right.
baptized in physical water. And like
Mhm.
I mentioned before, they cry oftentimes. They
Yeah.
confess with their mouth
Mhm.
in Romans 10. That
Yeah.
all involves physics.
Yeah.
So whether it's, no matter how you want to slice it and dice it,
Mhm.
metaphoric language, spiritual language, it is so intrinsic with the physical body if you are alive and you are experiencing the fulfillment of these texts.
Yeah.
And so, we talked about in the past, Steve, about, I believe it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul was, well, some theologians have stated whether it was Paul or his comrade that was caught up into the third heavens. You
Right.
see the exact same Greek phrase, catching away or being caught up, right? Can we expound on that verse of scripture, when Paul or his comrade, however you want to interpret it, was caught up in the third heavens, and he processed information which he stated that I heard things that were unlawful for me to utter, or things that
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
incapable to utter. Could you please expound on that? Some people have stated that maybe he had an outer body experience. Like, did
Well,
his
maybe he did, but even if he did, when he's either writing about it or telling his buddies about it, it's being translated into neurophysiology at that
yes,
time.
yes,
So, I think this brings up the whole thing is that, can consciousness exist outside of the neural experience? And maybe
correct,
it can. Like I've had a couple of patients in the past that had heart attacks, and in one particular case, the guy was watching his body being revived on the table, and the emergency room physician that attended him basically was like, there's no way that you should know what you know, right? And so I
wow,
know this guy today. I could go talk to him today, and like he's convinced that he experienced something, out of body, right? And so if that's the case, then any of these experiences, and I'll tell you, like if Paul wasn't pretty clear that something like that was possible, why not forget exactly where this may be in Philippians too, but why would he make a case of like, man, I would really prefer to depart out of here. I would rather
wow,
depart out of here and be with Christ than to
wow,
stay, but it's expedient for me to stay for you. In other words, I'm staying to help you all out, but I'd really prefer to depart and be with Christ. Why would you ever? Why would you? I mean, how many people do you know today that truly know this for sure? Like we should test that out. Like, everybody that's claiming to be a believer, how many people are that certain in their knowing that they would say, you know what? I don't really want to be here. I'd rather depart and be with Christ. And I
yeah,
know a lot of people say it, but then, I don't see a whole lot of people. I see a whole lot of people straddling the fence there. They say it because they're pretty confident of going somewhere when they die. But when you talk to them, unless they're in some major, chronic disease, end stage suffering, they'll say, well, I want to go to heaven, but just not yet, kind of idea. But Paul is basically saying, I'm ready to get out of here, man.
he's ready to get out of here.
So he sees something that's possible outside of what I think most of us may say it because we've been imprinted with that information. But to me, it's a whole nother thing to be living it. Like I cannot say honestly, sitting right here, that I would rather be in some other domain than sitting right where I am right now. I cannot honestly say that. In all honesty, I'd rather be right where I am in pursuit of what I'm coming into. And I do believe we can be influenced by something higher than us. At this point, I've had too many experiences to not trust that. I don't know how to explain it all, but I do know for sure that when I pray to who I believe is being revealed to me exists, all right, that if I'm struggling with something inside and I pray that it be relieved, in other words, I'm struggling with it because I'm looking within, I have countless numbers of times prayed for that to resolve, and it has resolved. I've kept daily notes about it. I mean, like, hey, I asked for this on so-and-so time and it happened. So I'm convinced at this point that there is something higher than us, higher in consciousness. I guess where I differ now is I view whatever that is wants us to come into our best. I mean, wants us to come into our best. In other words, has a vested interest in us getting it, so to speak.
Yeah.
And
And
so
and
for
that
me, that
that seems to be an attribute of the final eschaton, you know, and that best state was being immortal. That best state was being forever with Christ.
yeah.
Terrific. Brian, did you want to interject?
Um, well, I guess my only question would be, and this has been a great presentation, Dr. Cox. I guess my only question would be, do you think there's like a psychological dimension of full preterism? Say, well, let's just say covenant eschatology, maybe they're making these conclusions because there's a psychological factor that if they don't say, if they don't
Mm,
say that it was all fulfilled, it may break their faith in, the creator. I know that Tristan's talked about that before.
Yeah.
We need to keep this thing rolling because it's, religious, the religious mentality is, you get a lot of different birds,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering, how much is this? Because they'll say that everything is spiritual, oh, this is spiritual, that's spiritual. But is
Yeah.
a lot of this really actually psychological? Is there a psychological driver maybe behind this where it's making them, ignore some of these things and just making them keep repeating these same conclusions over and over again?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we're all shaped by it. I mean, like right now, as I sit here and I demonstrate this when I go and do talks for these groups of doctors, when stuff comes to me, I try to act it out in real time. That's my way of being transparent. In other words, I try to share experiences that are happening in real time. So even right now, if I'm sitting here, I can see an aspect of myself that is still very much influenced by my Baptist upbringing. I can see it when I close my eyes. I think we have the ability of a type of self-reflection, and there's some actual studies being done on this out of New Zealand right now on certain aspects of body structure changing certain areas of brain that not only deal with the prefrontal cortex, but also deal with the areas of the brain that deal with self-identity. So it's fascinating to me that we can become aware of other aspects of ourself. I mean, to me, it's a fascinating thing. How that ties into what you're saying is everybody, no matter what perspective they're coming from now, has come from some influence. I mean, there's a guy here. He's a deacon in one of the local churches of Christ, and I had a patient that said, "Oh man, you need to get with him, and he's got ways of looking at different views, and he'll create a study for you based on how you want to talk about a particular subject matter." So I met with him, and what he really wanted to do was convince me of his view. And so the more that I went over the Bible with him, there was a time in which I remember early on, like he wanted to quit. Like he wanted to. I remember we were at this little restaurant. And he's like, "We're just never going to see eye to eye." And he started to get up from the table. And I said, "Are you telling me that you've got two people here that claim to be about Jesus Christ?" Because at the time, I mean, I never let go of my belief that Jesus was helping us all get our act together, essentially. And I said, "Are you trying to tell me that both of us are claiming Christ and we can't appeal to him and let him reconcile our own differences?" I said, that's sad. And he actually sat back down at that point, and we ended up meeting again for the next 4 months or so. And as I would bring up stuff to him, like he had a view in there, for example, that he believed that the written scripture was the perfect that was to come. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like that? You really believe that? I was like, to me, it's very clear that the perfect that was to come was Christ. That's what they were waiting on. They were waiting for the perfection in Christ to come. Just because we have a put together canon of letters does not mean that that's the perfection. But he was convinced that that was the perfection. And he also was convinced that, people were in Hades. Like, I mean, that's part of their worldview. And his view is that, everybody goes there, but if you're a believer, you go to paradise. And if you're an unbeliever, you go to Hades. And none of that's going to change until the end of the world. In other words, when Christ comes back, it's game over. And I was like, man, what do you do with scriptures like world without end, amen? I mean, how do you get around any of these things? And so I remember he just jokingly said to me one time when he got up, he goes, "You realize nobody's going to ever believe all this stuff you're saying, right?" And I was like, yeah, they will believe it, because eventually when you make enough sense and you have enough experiences to back it up and you can explain it well enough, it will move the needle. I am convinced of that. But I don't believe you get there by living in a type of psychology in which it's driven. There's an imperative that it has to be a certain way, or there's major loss. That's a huge loss, is a huge psychological driver. None of us want to experience loss in areas that we're attached. None of us. If you're attached to something, you don't want to lose it. I don't care whether it's a toy from childhood or a spouse, a mate, whatever. If you're attached to it, you don't want to lose it, because the attachment is linked to survival for you.
Mm.
And so that it plays a huge role in the psychological makeup of things. And when I hear a lot, William Bell, Don Preston, and I mean, I'm super respectful for all the work they've put in just to be able to do as many YouTube videos as they have. I think it's fascinating. But it seems like to me that there's a lot of solace in the fact that it's done. And so if something's done, then you can work toward that. Now, I don't disagree with that at all. That's why I got excited about when I started looking from a full preterist perspective at first. I was like, oh my God, this really opens up the door for what I always wanted. It's done. I'm not waiting on anything. As a little boy, I told Tristan about this one time. I mean, I was so steeped in that view of when Christ came, it was all done. And that was from a Baptist perspective. I told Tristan there were days when things were going really crummy, like you were down on your luck, or you just didn't feel like you had any friends or whatever. You were just miserable in your subjective experience. And you're thinking, oh man, Lord, please come today. Like you're great with it. And then something good comes into your life and you think it's great. And you're going, hey, maybe would you put it on hold? Don't come today. I mean, that's how indoctrinated a lot of us can be because of messages that come to us. So I think when you're looking at it from a psychological imperative, it's going to be weighted on what are you going to lose if your view is totally and completely proven wrong. I mean, what would you lose?
Yeah, are we saying if the voices of full preterism were to just simply say that they were wrong, that they would lose? I personally believe that if they, which many full preterists have already rejected this whole dancing in the streets idea, and even the covenantal view. Ed Stevens is one of them. I spoke to him personally. He holds to this bodily taken away view, and yet he's still a full preterist. I personally don't believe that if Don or William Bell, if they had changed views, I think that their followers may just follow them. We've changed views many times, from futurism and then became full preterists, and then some have went back to futurism, and there's no shame in that. There's no shame in this journey of theology. I actually commend those who lose out if they have a change of theological views. I mean, I think we've all experienced that in many degrees, where if you change a view and you make that known to the public, that you're going to lose out. But I thought we're supposed to count things lost for Christ, right? Count things lost for this truth that we're all trying to pursue. And that'd be my take on it. Anything else?
Did that answer your question, Brian? I don't know if I interpret it as if you were saying, in other words, is there a psychological driver as to holding on to a particular viewpoint? Meaning, if somebody undeniably proved unfulfilled prophecy, but Christ was still real, and there is something coming in the future, what would that change? Am I clear on that?
Yeah. It was a good answer. Very good. Very comprehensive.
Well, I think that in of itself is big, because I think it is part of the psychological nature of human beings to seek resolution of dissonance. We don't like things when it feels dissonant. Again, as a feeler, I can feel things in my body. Like I'm pretty good at feeling where like in my, internal organ systems, for example, because that's one of the places where different types of fears and stressors can be held. I mean, I see it all the time where I palpate somebody's abdomen and I go like, oh my gosh, I mean, what's there? And I mean, you can do sometimes general releases, or you'll talk to them and they'll say, oh my gosh, I've held stuff there forever. And I mean, as their nervous system quiets, you can literally feel, see, and hear the effects of the neurological change on those visceral systems. I see it daily. So to me, I don't think that we can undertalk the psychological bondage of punishment, fear, the aspects of being wrong. I mean, being wrong comes with a lot. I mean, I can't stand it myself. I mean, and I do pray. I'm still a big prayer. For me, it's a central part of my life, even though I've got a bunch of unanswered questions. Before I came on this program, I spent all day basically asking God, at least to who I perceive God to be based on relational things I've experienced, like, please don't let me say anything wrong. Like, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to say anything, not truthful. I don't want to influence anybody in a negative way, especially if it's false. I mean, that's a big deal to me. I don't like the idea of causing somebody else problems because I misspeak or say something, inappropriate. There's just part of my makeup. I don't like it at all. And so, I just think that it's a big deal when we have a lot vested in something. Like I have a lot vested, I believe, in coming into something bigger. I see where things go if you don't have some type of transformative change, and it's not really a direction I want to go in. So I'm vested in pursuing things that are allowing for neurobiological change. I'm driven for it, and I love seeing that happen in other people. Not only as a traditional clinician in assessing problems, but I also feel like a lot of times I operate in a facilitator role where a facilitator can make things happen faster, whereas an inhibitor would block things. I feel like a lot of times something I bring to the table makes things happen faster, and in a lot of cases, it makes people deal with their conflict, even if I don't want to be doing it. I've seen this over and over again. And so that's where my journey has come. And I think that came out in that dialogue with Don Preston that day on that phone years back. And I think it happened in the last Facebook exchange I had with him, and it's on there. I've saved every bit of it. But it's like toward the end, I got the sense of, some of the things I was saying were very clear to me, and I feel like they were very provocative to him. And I think his responsive tone was showing where it poked a little bit of conflict, just like somebody could do with me, and I didn't do it to do that to him. But I think that when we see where we're in conflict, it's actually an opportunity for resolution. It's actually an opportunity for clarity.
Wow.
And in that way, we could all help each other if we knew that we were helping each other for something good.
Yeah.
And I think I'm motivated by that. I think that's why a small group of people that are sincerely seeking the truth, and in other words, there's going to be good that comes out of it, right? I think that openness can be a game changer for the world. I really do.
Perfect. Wonderful. Brian, did you want to say anything else?
No, not right now. We do have a question though coming in from SoCal Preston, and he wants to know why are most full preterists men and not women? This is a question for both, and I don't know. That's a strange one. I think there's women out there, but you guys go ahead and answer that. Why is it men and not women? I don't know if that was a serious question. I actually think he may be pulling our leg a little bit, because I know there are some women out there who endorse. In fact, when I was on Don Preston's channel, when I was just debating in the comments I did that for a couple of years. I ran into the people that gave me the hardest time on his channel were some of his female followers.
Yeah.
I can tell you that.
Yeah. There's a couple of ladies I see that I've seen respond to things I've observed in back and forth between Don Preston and Tristan. There's one particular lady, I forget her name, but man, she always comes to Don's rescue in there. And I think back when I kind of embarked on this journey, after I had spoken with Michael Miano, and he was super nice on the phone. I mean, everybody that I've encountered, I mean, has tried to be helpful in their own way. So it's not anything negative about anybody. But I remember there was a lady at the time that had been big time connected with, Don Preston, all the full preterism stuff, was Jen Fishburne. I think she ended up doing her own thing, and she's got, at one time, I know that her kind of claim to fame is that she was, I forget what she used to say, like 90% or greater IO, but then there was a certain percentage that still wasn't. I don't know if she still kind of holds to that or whatever, but I mean, I think she was a pretty strong, so I think she had a lot of support for things that she believed and wanted to be a teacher and what have you. So, but when you do see those pictures of a lot of those conferences, it is a lot of those male leaders in that, so I don't know. I really don't know what the deal is with that.
Yeah, I think he was probably just joking.
And
Thanks, so yeah, we appreciate that. So, guys, we're almost at the 90-minute mark. I know that both of you probably have other things to do. Is there any last words, maybe, that you want to give? Maybe any last questions or last points you wanted to bring out?
Yeah, I just want to, make some more confirmations on this. The intention of having this podcast was, introducing this clinical doctor to the theological view of a spiritual resurrection, a covenantal change, a moral change, which the covenant full preterist view, which has influenced all three of us here. It's influenced everyone in the preterist circles. I think this is so very important. And I personally believe that I am helping the full preterist scholars. I think that they should write literature on this. I would like to ask one question to you, Brian. What did you think about the dancing in the streets comment from Don in his debate?
Yeah, that was something, and I don't know. I understand his view on that, but yeah, I don't think there was a lot of dancing in the streets. I don't see that. I mean, I see the need for him to say something like that because you have to give an answer. I don't think it makes sense. I agree with you and you guys that that's probably not a very good answer.
Yeah, and many full preterists have rejected it. And I think that those who are supporting the Prestonian preterists, they need to further expound on this. But the covenantal view, the spiritual resurrection, it had to have involved some sort of physical reaction. There are plenty of studies from neuroscientists and epistemologists who've been doing years of clinical studies on religious experiences. And I think that this has blindsided the full preterist voices. Not all, I'm talking about the Max King covenantal view, that they're just completely ignorant of these two highly respectable academic fields of religious epistemology, the epistemology of religious experience, and neuroscience, and how this is involved even until this very day. So again, Dr. Cox, I want to thank you for your input and all the work that you have given for your patients, for humanity. I sense that you have a very genuine approach, very sincere, and I felt that kinship. Any last words for yourself?
Well, just that I guess my hope is that that everybody that's in pursuit realizes that these different views and the questions we're all proposing, they may be taking us somewhere. So it's worth engaging in the dialogue. It's worth it's worth asking the hard questions, because if it is failed prophecy, but yet there is truth to the narrative, like there is a bigger picture, then what are any of us doing to align with that so that we end up in a coherent, single-mindedness? I mean, where we're not so divided. I mean, I don't know how, how you can have, I think there's 46,000 denominations of Christianity or something along those lines. I mean, if you're under the guidance of one leader, I mean, even from a military perspective, I mean, the military doesn't really do that well when there's not chain of command. I mean, it can end up creating major chaos. So if Christ is the head and different people in the body have different roles. Why can't everybody get on the same page with a clear vision for the future and know what their role is? It doesn't mean that everybody has the same role, but you should get clearer in knowing what your role is. You know, are you a cook? Are you a warrior? Are you this? I mean, if you want to use those kind of, you know, things, but who are you and what are you doing? So if you're not getting those answers, why not? Right? I mean, that would be from a moving forward as a coherent group of people seeking something. If it has already occurred, and the already done is evidence of the kingdom manifestation, where is the power that comes from the kingdom? I mean, even from a narrative of, you know, the kingdom comes in, you know, not just in word, but in power. Like, where is the power? Like, where is the real power? Where are the people that are, if you're a disciple of Christ, and he's basically says, hey, whatsoever things you say, and you don't doubt it in your heart, you'll have whatsoever you say, which you know, dovetails right in with certain Old Testament views of God, that God speaks things that be not as though they were. It was like Christ was saying, hey, those attributes of God, get in touch with them, you know, use them, live from there. So where is that? Like, why are we not all operating in that level of power, and why are we not helping each other strengthen that level of power? You know, those to me are critical questions. And if the focus was on stuff like that, so if the story's real and the kingdom is real, why are we all not experiencing more power from that and actually making change? You know, and so I think this whole thing is an opportunity for us all to examine our own conflict and start asking, wow, is this happening to bring us all into a greater level of clarity? And what are we all doing with each other to come more into that clarity? You know, how are we trying to help each other as opposed to guarding a view? I personally don't really care. I just want the truth. And that is, I don't know how to be more clear than that. I just simply want the truth about it because I think the truth matters. And so that's, you know, that's how I'd like to, you know, end with that piece.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Cox, for your expertise, and I also want to thank you, Tristan, for engaging and you know, bringing him here. And it's been a great discussion, gentlemen. I guess with that, I guess we can end the discussion. It's been wonderful. I hope you guys both have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.